Forward TV. The world is thinking.
One way to think about this whole area is to perhaps look back at the Beijing Olympics, because I think if we think about the emerging economies, especially China and even India, the Olympics, for me, I think transformed our expectations of what, say, the Chinese are really capable of. And probably confirmed much what many of us already knew about what's going on in China, but others, maybe we were quite shocked about what they were capable of doing, because they exhibited an amazing amount, in my opinion, of engineering prowess, the stadiums, the transportation, just the general built environment, which was built for a purpose. And what they did there, I think, really transformed our expectations of the Chinese in terms of their ability to demonstrate their technology, innovation and capability. And same with their kind of project management. Many of the projects were on time and even under budget, which is something completely unheard of in the West. So quite a high degree, I think, of jealousy there really exists in terms of what the Chinese were capable of doing. And I think not least the Chinese games, for me, exhibited a massive amount of Chinese creativity, something we would never really associate, I think, and this is something perhaps to explore, that we would ordinarily view the Chinese as being creative. They are this kind of powerhouse, but they have no kind of ideas of their own. So the Olympics, for me, really, shook our sort of notions of the emerging economy, shall we say, in terms of what they're capable of on many, many levels. But however, even though they achieved what some thought was unachievable, how they innovated, I think, in many ways, was probably still questioned. It still inherently has some kind of prejudice sort of bubbling up from us in the West, because many of the sentiments were that they just spent their way into the games, they spent their way through it, they spent the most than anyone else in history, so of course when you have that much money you're going to do something incredible. It wasn't necessarily the nature of their ideas per se. And secondly, lots of people have said, well, actually their know-how was actually really based on Western ideas anyway, so what really did the Chinese themselves bring to the table, apart from the might of their engineers and their sort of physical resources? So again, we kind of gave them the ideas and they just went away and did it. And I think, in a very simplistic way perhaps, but, what happened there still sort of provides us with a bit of our own sort of ability to kind of, question some of those achievements. And so with that in mind, I think, what I'd like to do here is to examine, firstly, what is actually going on in, say, China and India per se, when we talk about innovation and technological development. Is it how we think it is, or is it something qualitatively different? And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, examine our attitudes towards that development. Because to many intents and purposes, we don't necessarily seem to embrace it as well as we perhaps should. And that's something to really focus on. So, very quickly, I have a few other examples which I'd like the panelists to also perhaps bring some more to the table. But, so in terms of growth, there are massive things going on in China, but very rarely they get heard about. So, for example, Hitachi, the Japanese telecoms manufacturer, for instance, surveyed consumer usage of digital media in comparison from Chinese to the US. And they found, quite amazingly extraordinary for themselves, that the disk drives of China are packed far more with more stuff than, say, the average US consumer. And you'd obviously assume the US have a more sort of a akin nature when it comes to digital consumption. However, they found that the Chinese consumer on average has 1,300 songs, over 3,000 photos, and 24 movies and 22 games on their hard drives. And you think, well, the Chinese have never really grasped that sort of digital culture, but evidently they have. And it said that the average 18 to 24-year-old has over 3,000 songs on average, compared to only 2,000 songs for the average US consumer. So the Chinese are, from that, embracing digital media than perhaps we are in the West. However, you get that sense of growth, but then you also get us arguing that the Chinese themselves perhaps should be a bit more responsible in terms of how they embrace the opportunities that technology and innovation could give them. So we have the economists recently saying, well, looking at the kind of the Chinese sort of period of growth, saying, well, actually, it's all well and good. They are growing at an extraordinary rate, but really what they need to do is actually invest their existing know-how into developing the world rather than inventing new ideas and innovating afresh. So it's more the case that they have to be far more responsible in how they develop themselves rather than becoming irresponsible and akin to kind of experimentation. And then lastly, you know, there is, I think, kind of downright prejudice, perhaps in terms of how we, the West, understand our relationship to the East and the Chinese in particular. So the Design Council, you know, obviously very fearful of the emerging economy and how we can ourselves compete, says, well, how do we utilise design in this situation? And so Sir George Cox, the Design Council chairman, you know, said recently on their website, you know, with a sort of, I think, a kind of a prejudiced view of others who are not the UK, said that, you know, we have a window of opportunity, especially while other countries seek to replicate our existing strengths, such as awareness of consumer rights and needs. You know, others who are not the UK don't really understand consumer rights and certainly don't understand consumer needs at all. You know, they just throw things out there in the marketplace and hope they stick, where we are far more focused. So look, there's just a few examples which I'd certainly like the panelists to come back to and to discuss in more detail. So for me, you know, really, is all of this, what's going on in the East, an opportunity for us, or is it really a sign of our own, perhaps jealousy, ignorance and paranoia that we are unable to engage with it in any real serious way? I think that's probably where I'd like the kind of the debate to kind of kick off from, and then we'll see where we go. Right, so enough about my thoughts. We'll turn to the speakers. So in order of actually how you're sitting, I'll introduce them. So we have director on my right, Dr. Norman Lewis. So he's got 10 years experience in telecoms innovation. Norman is recognised worldwide as an expert on future trends and user behaviour and around voice and messaging and digital lifestyles. Previously, he was Director of Technology Research for Orange UK, and now he's the Chief Strategy Officer of Wireless Grids Corporation USA. And he's also the author of Innovating for the Future, Digital Kids and the Customer of the Future. Next, we have Parminder Bahra. Parminder is Chief Executive, maybe you'll have an update on that.
Executive Editor.
Chief Executive Editor of Times Online, and he's been a journalist for 13 years, including with the Times and the Financial Times, and amongst other things, he also goes on electoral observation missions for the Organisation for Security and Development in Europe, and has been to places like Kosovo, Macedonia, and the Ukraine in this capacity. And last but not least, we have Dinah McLeod. Dinah has joined BT in 2007 to head up their BT Global Services sustainability practice. Her key responsibility is to work with customers to encourage the adoption of more sustainable modes of business operation. And previously, she's worked for clients including the UK's Department for International Development, the Japanese International Development Agency, to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And until 2004, Dinah was policy advisor in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Joining the unit in 2002, she managed its work on energy and international development. So, can we just welcome our speakers this morning, and then we'll get on with the debate. Right, so as I said, so this is a conversation. You unfortunately don't have any introductions, but rather the chance to respond to a few questions I'm going to put to you to kick things off. So again, from what I said, I mean, what do you get from our attitude towards the development in the emerging economies? I mean, is it, as I say, perhaps a sign of our prejudice, that we don't engage, our kind of paranoia that they're doing things better than us, or even just plain ignorance? Norman.
Well, if this is a cafe conversation, can I have a cappuccino, please?
It's actually an conversation, I get it wrong.
Where's the coffee? Well, I actually think it's a combination of all those three. I have, for example, been tracking a lot of developments in the kind of internet, online space in Asia, and I'm absolutely astonished by the discussion that happens in the West about this, where there's complete ignorance of what's going on in China, and there's some truly phenomenal developments in China. So, for example, I can't ask this question because it was in the splurb for the session, but whenever I speak at events, I ask people, have you ever heard of QQ? And they look at me like I'm some kind of lunatic. QQ is the largest online instant messaging social network in the world. They have over 330 million active accounts, about at least almost 380 million registrations, 330 million active accounts on a daily basis. This is larger than the population of the United States of America. Remarkable about this company is that this year their projected revenues are to be $1 billion, of which $500 million is going to be operating profit. And remarkably, even more remarkably, only 12% of that revenue is generated through advertising. What they are, the way they generate their revenue is through kids in particular, 18 to 24-year-olds, buying digital goods, but at levels of 0.001 of a cent, where they buy digital goods, for example, weapons in games, or music, or background wallpapers for their living rooms, and avatars and how they dress themselves. It's all about self-expression, etc. This is actually remarkable because when you look at the discussion in the West about social networking, to a person, and I don't think I've yet seen a report in like The Economist or even some of the big analysts' reports saying that social networking is actually a profitable business. Last year, which everybody focuses on Facebook and MySpace, and last year Facebook lost $50 million. Here, in China, you've got a company that is and when you think about the disposable income of Chinese people, the degree to which they are able to generate that kind of profit is truly extraordinary. And what's so innovative about what they've done, it's nothing really particularly special. What they've done is two things. They've created a business model that allows them to monetize the desire, particularly of young people, to express themselves. And so they have the back-end systems that can handle micropayments, which, let it be said, is nothing new. We've been talking about this for years in the telecom business, about micropayments and mobile payments and all of this. But they have got such a sophisticated engine that can do this, that they can serve these kinds of things and target products, digital products, to the point where they've created the second innovative thing, which is they've created a virtual currency called QQ coins, which are now being used in the real world. They're exchanging QQ coins for real goods, for example, in shops, buying CDs or anything like that, to the extent that the central bank in China is actually arguing that they're going to ban this because they're fearful that this is going to destabilize the yuan. Which is, now you think about that, is truly extraordinary behavior and truly extraordinary innovation, but who's ever heard of it in the West? I mean, that's what I find incredible. So just my first take on this is that I do think that we are really seriously underestimating what's going on in this. And not only that, when you look at some of those markets, okay, we're not talking about the emerging economies, but if you talk about Japan or Korea, these are the most advanced internet infrastructures societies in the world, and what you would expect if you are an innovative company in the West is you'd be looking at these behaviors, because what they are doing, the kinds of things that people are starting to do with this kind of infrastructure, this level of speed, this etc. These behaviors, you can be sure, are going to be behaviors that are going to be replicated here in a few years' time. So why not be looking at this as a way of foreseeing the future and perhaps seeing some new opportunities of where you could begin to innovate in the West. And I can assure you, hardly anybody is doing this.
Okay.
They're not. I know that in my professional position when I was in Orange, I took a team of people over to Asia. This is 5 years ago. So when we first met QQ, when they came, it was 10-cent communications, and the attitude was, it's Asia. This is culturally specific. And when I heard the kind of explanations, like Japanese people we know are into mobile technology because they've got small fingers, and Koreans are into ringback tones because they like karaoke. So this kind of moronically superficial, stupid cultural stereotypes, which prevent us from actually looking at what's really going on. So I do think that this is a real problem. It shows more about our attitude to innovation than what they are doing.
Parminder, what do you think?
I think there's also the business that you Martyn, might be familiar also with the design aspects of Japanese technology, and particularly cars, and how they didn't know how to design cars that look good many years ago, and I think it's a similar kind of argument. It's just extended extends itself. I'd want to just kind of broaden it out a little bit further, and say, I'm executive editor of Times Online, and which, my business, as it were, journalism, media, and particularly the Times, has been around for 223 years, and our digital experience is about 10 years. And I'm speaking partly as a sort of frustrated pioneer trying to move Times journalism into the digital platform, and seeing the kind of obstacles that we face, and the prejudices as well. And that's just within the UK. And the piece, I wrote a small piece, I think Norman wrote a piece as well on Times Online, and it was about how we need to embrace the nerd and the fact that we still have a sort of technophobe attitude. And that's just internally. So if internally we have this problem with understanding pioneering technology and appreciating it, and the fact that I might turn up with a laptop and people might look at me and go, "Why you brought your laptop with you?" Before we even get into the international realm, that we need to figure out things at home, and actually start looking at how we can embrace technology, and to take it a little bit further or to take this into a theoretical sort of arena, and why this is so important is that the business models that Norman touched on briefly there are changing, and that we are now entering a landscape where we are going to have to reevaluate what we do. In my industry, the media industry, there was an article recently, it was a blog post, of course it wouldn't be an article, but a blog post by Jeff Jarvis, who was basically saying that the article as the main currency for journalism is going to die, because actually it served its purpose and served it very well within the print format. But in a digital platform, it's very different. It doesn't serve the same purpose. We have to be more innovative about how we use these devices, and that's just journalism. If we then go into industry, I don't know if you're familiar with Don Tatscott, who's written a book called Wikinomics, which I think is a very good read, because there's some very interesting ideas and some very interesting examples. One of which is the company Goldcore, which is a mining company that basically was losing lots of money, and it really was facing bankruptcy. And the owner of the company, having had some conversations with, I think, some of his Silicon Valley friends, came to the conclusion that what he would do is sort of harness the crowd and say, okay, I'll give all my research, all the geology and everything, all the information that normally in any other business or any other business model would be highly, highly sensitive, and you'd never, ever offer this up to anyone and the public in particular. He said, okay, here it all is. If you out there on the web think you know where to find the most richest mines, then tell me and you can have a percentage and a proportion. And he effectively had the World Wide Web and everyone connected with it offering themselves up. And they had responses from various different types of people from different disciplines. And to cut a long story short, that sort of 6 years on down the line, 7 years on, they're now a multi-billion dollar business, which is very successful. And this is a model which is completely different to what we experienced in the past. So these are the sort of challenges in the landscape that we work within. And so for that reason, we have to really consider what are the challenges coming from India and China. And in one respect, I think, yes, we are being a little bit where we're not facing up to the challenges that are coming in the future, and as India and China develop. At the same time, I'd say that I'm not entirely convinced that the challenge and the threat is as strong as some people might make out. And the fact that just to throw up a few kind of ideas, one of the businesses of outsourcing was that outsourcing, the key factor in outsourcing was price. It was about usually labour, but it was also about technology pricing. And the fact that I think I'm still not convinced that a lot of the industry and the business that we might lose to places like India and China isn't based around labour and pricing of labour. And so it is a wage effect, and that will always be something difficult to challenge. And I'm not entirely convinced that there is technology. One of the examples is Spielberg and Bollywood doing a deal. Reliance, I think, is the corporation in India that has invested in Spielberg's business, and from what I could read, his main interest was the fact that they were taking a stake in it, and that there was opportunities to do joint business, but they were prepared to pay this money to have a seat at next to Spielberg. And similarly, there's much discussion about companies like Tata who are effectively overpaying for their purchases, like Jaguar that they took over, and they have to do this in order to show that they're an international player. But this is all well and good whilst credit was quite loose and free and easy, but actually now we'll see a different landscape because credit is tighter. And so I'm not entirely convinced that is that they're challenging us. And then finally, just to say that at the same time, in somewhere like India, you've got 300 million people who are living on less than $1 a day, and that there are sequencing of the priorities that Indian government, Chinese government have to consider, and if they have a look at technology, yes, it is a way forward, but I would be interested to see how they could use any of this. And I know that Dinah's going to mention something about this, I suspect, at some point, about the link between technology and development.
Okay, Dinah, what's your take?
Thank you. Well, I guess I wanted to start out by saying BT is sponsoring this, but this is entirely my opinion because they don't listen to me enough, and until they do, I'll just keep to myself. I was going to mention, first of all, this idea of cultural stereotyping. As you were talking about, people look at you funny when you take a computer into the room. I used to take a computer into the room until I realized that when I did so, everyone thought I was the secretary taking notes. And so I stopped doing that, and I went back to my handwritten notes. And just to point out that cultural stereotyping in this space is wide-ranging, and if one is not an IT geek, then I think there's a lot of possibility that there's misunderstanding there about when it comes to technology. The second thing is to say that I come from a background in international development, and yes to the idea of cultural stereotyping there, and the idea of the sort of rift between them over there and they're poor, and us over here, and we're the innovators. Because I saw that more or less all the way through my career as an international development specialist, is that there's this one-way traffic flow that we foist ideas upon them that they take up or they don't, Washington consensus being one of them. And this just seems to me another iteration of that kind of conversation where people are not here taking advantage. I mean, right now, as I don't know much about IT. I work for an IT company in an IT job. I've been there for 15 months, and all I do is I nick ideas from my last job because no one else, there's this wonderful treasure trove of intellect and information that is out there that nobody really understands or takes advantage of. So, for example, I'm just, again, not India and China, but Safaricom in Africa has invented ways of mobile banking for the unbanked populations. And this is absolutely transforming the lives of poor people in Africa because they can't go into banks being illiterate, trying to open a bank account because they get laughed at usually because they're poor. And so this is a way that they can actually store and use and transfer currency. Now, 8% of the UK population is also unbanked. So why aren't we using the same kind of technology? It's astonishing to me the number of tricks we're not missing, that we are missing, I should say. So yes to a lot of cultural prejudices, and yes to IT as one of the areas in which this is particularly the case. However, I'm going to make the argument, probably unpopular on the panel, that in fact some of the software examples that were given here are in fact not transforming and innovative. They're morally just more of the same. I mean, population of China is 1.3 billion, of India 1.13 billion. There's going to be some ideas out there, and they're going to get they're going to be developing some sort of software. at least some of them. And so it's purely a numbers game, I would say. A QQ, for example, not that I've ever been near QQ. In fact, that was the name of my teddy bear when I was a kid. But QQ, as I understand it, it started earlier, admittedly, than its rivals, than its other social networking rivals in the West. But lately, it's become very much like Windows Live Messenger, as I understand it. So it's another example of where a good idea has been taken, shaped, and used in a market where there is not a lot of competition in that space. And the same with the blurb for this workshop was quoting also Todo, which is a video sharing site. And this is all, it's more minutes streamed than YouTube, and this is really a sort of a huge and powerful force, and I agree with that. But it was founded by a Chinese guy who had lived in the States until he went back to China, and a Dutch guy. And their seed funding came from the United States. So why is that an example of Chinese innovation? And I would argue that things like that, like SciWorld, another example of a South Korean software program that uses currency. But why is it a surprise that there are these software programs that are using currency? There's a lack of alternatives for young people in a lot of these places. Digital media is a great new thing for them, and there are very few other things that kids can do, I think, in China that are as appealing, whereas a kid in the US, they have game boxes, they have Xboxes, they have all sorts of other choices out there. And so I would argue that what we have seen, or what has been quoted as some of the technological innovations coming out, are not so. They're not transformative. And China, for example, I mean, QQ doesn't sound like the equivalent, the IT equivalent of gunpowder. I mean, this is very, very, it's reductive, it's borrowing, and it's everything that we associate. And that's not to say that in 20 years that's going to be the same case, because there's going to be some amazing things. Once they learn and start to replicate, then they'll get the ideas in the IT space. But until then, I don't think we've seen the innovation.
Okay, I mean, let me perhaps try and raise the stakes a little bit, because, I mean, what's your reaction to kind of risk-taking? Because I think from what I sort of gathered from your responses is that perhaps, you know, our sort of ability to export ideas to the East itself is pretty lame. And so that, you know, for example, you talk about, you know, the collapse of journalism, for example, and that, you know, to me is evident of perhaps not being able to engage intellectually with kind of ideas and how to, you know, conjure up new sort of means to communicate, but rather we sort of go for the kind of wikinomic sort of thing, or crowdsourcing kind of notion of generating ideas where, you know, it's more that we don't necessarily think ourselves capable sort of individually or even via a company to generate ideas. We have to throw them out to the crowd. It just seems to be kind of a collapse of confidence, shall we say, and even the ability to take risks. And therefore we seem quite reluctant to also, you know, export that ability to take risks to the East, because we don't want to do them harm, you know, per se either. But then again, you know, are we also saying that, you know, via examples of social networking and so on in the East themselves, that's not particularly either risk-taking, very innovative, as you know, Dinah, you say. So it seems to me we're all quite unconfident about what we really want from, say, new technology, for example, or innovation per se, and perhaps we're too fearful of what this might do to the East, even though in the West we're also quite, you know, conscious of that. I mean, how do you react? I mean, do you think there's a real case now to be risk-taking? I mean, I don't really get that sense from many of your comments.
Well, by way of answering that, just to fill in some of the gaps in what I was arguing, because I'm not in any way arguing that QQ and any of these things represent great innovations, in the sense that, yes, they are replications. Well, it's an interesting point. SciWorld was the first social network in the world. So in fact, MySpace is a replication of SciWorld, not the other way around, which is quite an interesting anomaly. That's part of my point in the first instance, that there is this kind of prejudice about this as to where these things came from. But yes, you're right, it's in that same kind of space. Where I said the innovation was in QQ was in the business model, not in the technology or anything like that. And whether you think social networking is as the equivalent of gunpowder or penicillin, no one would make that argument. I think it's, quite childish and whatever, but that's really irrelevant. I think the important point really behind all of this, and this is just to throw this question out to everybody to think about, is, you see, I believe that in Asia today, what we see really happening is a kind of very pragmatic adoption of technology, software, whatever, which are then being applied in numerous places. You think of India or even in China, where they're actually being very, very successful in being able to take certain innovations and take them to market in a far speedier way. And in some cases, perhaps even more, being willing to take more risks in doing this. What I don't see yet is I don't see the initiation or the kind of basic research that's going to give the next big major breakthrough for the future of humanity coming yet. But you've got to be very careful about this, because when you actually examine what's happening in R&D in India or in China, particularly in China, you remember, whenever you look at this, you're looking at it at a particular moment, and what you've got to look at is the dynamic behind that. Because what's happening is that the rise in R&D in China is happening at a phenomenally fast rate. In fact, I think somebody was arguing yesterday that China today is spending now more as a percentage of its GDP than the US on R&D. Now, you can look at some of that R&D and you can say, all right, a lot of that is about the development side of things, but there is a lot of basic research starting to happen, surprisingly, in things like pharmaceuticals, nanotechnologies, etc. And where I agree with the one point you're making, Dinah, is that when you have this kind of a dynamic established in a country which is growing, where there is a dynamism, where there is a kind of embracing of the future, not the past, as what I think is happening in the West in particular, then you do unleash a certain dynamic. You do unleash, and I would expect, given the scale of the problems that they are going to be dealing with, and I think that the kind of social inequalities, all of these things, that the questions of pollution in their cities and all of it, they are going to come up with solutions because of necessity in those circumstances that will be way above anything that we've done in the West. Not because they are super clever or whatever, but because they are starting from a different basis, and because there is an attitude that they can. That in fact, in and of itself, that's going to be a good thing. Now, I don't know the extent to which that really does exist in China today, or I think there is a real belief in technology, and that through technology they can uplift their societies, and that's a very different environment to what we have in the West, where we are now so skeptical of this, that everything is bad for the environment, etc., etc., that we're polluting the world, etc., etc. So I think that that's a very interesting discussion to be had, because when I look at it and I look at what's happening globally around R&D, the trend in the West is that whilst the overall spend is going up, more and more money is going towards development, i.e. what technologies can we commercialize and what can we be sure of? That's the kind of mindset in the West. It's a kind of very short term, driven by next quarterly results. We want predictability. We want to put X amount of dollars in and we want to get X amount of dollars back, and we want to know we're going to get them back in the next quarter. Whereas I think there is much more of a longer term thinking going on in India and China, and that for me is a real sense of, I have a certain amount of optimism as a consequence of that. So I would embrace the notion that there is real innovation starting to emerge in those countries, although we might be concentrating on the more superficial ones, like the social networks.
Okay. I mean, how do you both respond? Parminder, do you agree with that?
Well, I think part of that, or it would be interesting to get your thoughts, but part of it I think is because we have many mature industries here who developed over a number of years. I talked about the journalism and the media business, and I just think it's much easier. I think it's a lot easier for countries where you don't have these mature industries who are looking for immediate returns or looking short term. Certainly, if you've got a business worth £1 million a year, but there is transition and that things are changing. and that the rate at which it changes is about sort of 6-7% a year. You're not going to be changing and innovating in a hurry, because you've still got this sort of £1 million turnover that you're having to look after, and that, I think that feeds into part of the short-termism that Norman mentions. And I think I said I'm throwing this up more than I don't know as much about this. But
do you think that? Do you think that large corporations are just incapable now of innovating because they have so much kind of overhead and? I
don't know. I don't think. I think there are. I do believe they can innovate, and they do show innovation. But the motivation and the incentives to invest in these areas is not there. It's interesting. About a year ago, I went to a conference called Silicon Valley at Said Business School in Oxford. And the one thing that all of these entrepreneurs, and most of the guys who are there are sort of single man, woman band entrepreneurs, the one thing that they insisted on was an environment, and Silicon Valley provides this, where you can fail, where you can make mistakes. And in fact, it's about 3 or 4 mistakes, before you actually hit the sort of nail on the head with whatever your business is going to be. And so there's no lack of ability, and there's no lack of sort of innovation going on, but actually are we fostering the right kind of landscape where people can excel in it?
Just to perhaps focus a bit more around your area as well, Dinah. I mean, because on the question around necessity, because I know you come from that kind of background about development and looking at the innovation in the third world around mobile and so on. I mean, how do you also kind of respond to that? I mean, do you think that China, for example, we need to go beyond necessity when we talk about invention and innovation, or should they just focus on that kind of need to include underdeveloped areas of the population and so on? I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I would just be in violent agreement, which is a bit boring, with the idea of basic research as being the real threat to the West. The emphasis on basic research and basic literacy is the thing that's going to distinguish developing countries that are on the up to those in the West. And I think that it's a huge public policy problem right now for the UK in particular, that basic research into the sciences and engineering is plummeting. And we're getting all of our brains from other sources. And it's getting back to the point expressed earlier about the race for the next big hit. Applied research and trying to go for a sure bet, the pharmaceutical kind of model that is going to choke us. And just in my personal life, my husband's an astronomer, and he's just been kicking ESA's reputation, the European Space Agency, because they did not partner in time on a new satellite project with the Chinese. And it turns out the Chinese, this is one of their big plays, and in 10 years it's going to look like one of the most short-sighted decisions ever. And it's basic research versus applied research, I think, is a fantastically important determinant of how this all plays out in the next 20 years. Second thing, though, is to ask about how much of what China and India are doing, how much of that you and I talked before the session started about how young people approach technology in a very different way, and how much of that is just that there are a lot of people who are just naturally embracing this because they're young and not migrants like most, well, I certainly am, to this space. And I was wondering if this is a cultural or in fact a generational divide that we're talking about more, and that there are simply more young people in China and India who are using and absolutely embracing this as the way that they can get themselves ahead. Those are the two things, I suppose. That's the talking point that I'd be interested in exploring a little more.
Okay, because I want to bring the audience in a few minutes. I mean, do you want to just quickly respond to that, if it's cultural, generational, both of you, and then we'll bring the audience in?
Well,
just make a fairly quick point.
Right, well, the quick point is that I don't think it's that. I think, you have a very similar dynamic in the West. Look at how young people embrace technologies here. That doesn't account for why what's happening in China is happening, or the dynamic that's established there. And I just perhaps to be a little bit provocative, while I'm making this point about, well, I think there is a very real dynamic being established in China and India, and the kind of R&D, and you can see, for example, the citations now of Chinese engineers in scientific papers has really risen. In fact, it's almost at the same level as English scientists. You know, there's a lot of statistics that show that there is a lot of real research going on. I'm not sure that necessity is the real driver of that innovation, because I think, in fact, it works in both directions. In fact, you could argue that invention has been the mother of necessity. In other words, human needs can change. And what gives me optimism in this instance is that because you've got that number of people, because that's the kind of real social resource that you are investing in, the fact that you have got different scale of problems means that there will be practical attempts to solve those problems, and as a consequence of that, that will push the boundaries of science. Because if you recall, you know, that there's many inventions that occurred that became very groundbreaking for human advancement that were not based on science. They were based on practicality, and the science followed. You know, take Edison. You know, he built his electrical systems without understanding mathematical equations that explained electricity. The steam engine was built by practitioners, not by people that understood. The Wright brothers were bicycle engineers. They knew nothing about aerodynamics. The mathematics and the science followed the practical creation of these things. And therefore, what undoubtedly you can say, without trying to, you know, foresee the future, that in China and India, because of the scale of the problem, but because of the dynamic, and what's more, I think the attitude towards the future and how they're embracing this, you know that they are going to come up with new practical solutions which will push the science, will push the boundaries of knowledge in ways that I think are being closed down in the West rather than the opposite. So
okay.
That's...
All right. Parminder, do you want to respond to that? Necessity is enough, or we have to go beyond?
In China and India.
Yeah, in terms of how they approach future development, innovation, and need.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I'd go back to the point I made initially, which was just that I think they're in a position where they can certainly innovate. They're in a better position to innovate because there's almost a sort of sense of less to lose. And to go back to the other point as well, certainly some of the forester research I've looked at suggested that across the board they are much more involved and much more engaged with the digital technology, and so the blogging, the social networking.
Cultural.
Yeah, and that's certainly very different to the UK. The US is slightly higher, but I think the US sits in the middle between UK and then Japan, South Korea, and China.
Okay. Right, let's open it up to you, the audience. I mean, we've got various kind of themes here. So is what's going on in China and India more a matter of culture, generational issues? Should we only view what they do there as necessity, or can we argue they need to go beyond basic applied research and so on? So, okay, down the front. I'm going to take a few questions and then we'll take it back to the panel.
It's not a developing country as such, but it's in the East. If you take Japan, it's interesting that Japan, you look at their manufacturing, it takes a totally different approach. They develop Six Sigma or what have you, no tolerance, zero tolerance to defects or what have you. When it comes to actually developing ideas, I also hear the alternative view, which is, the Japanese, they're very, what's the word, cliche, I don't know the word, but there's very little innovation. It's all doing what the chief does. I think it comes to the conclusion that really it all comes down to cultures, and maybe we need both countries, we need people to switch between the countries. And yes, let's get the Japanese to organise a manufacturing because they're very good at it. However, when it comes to thinking blue sky ideas, maybe we don't want Japanese, maybe that's something to get Americans to do, or even British. We're great at thinking of ideas, great for developing them, but so you need a mix of cultures.
Okay. Yeah?
Yeah, just to go back to...
Probably have to speak up a bit as well.
Just go back to what you mentioned in your introduction and what Norman just said a minute ago about practitioners. When you were introducing the session, you were talking about the Beijing Olympics and describing it. One way you could understand that development is, lots of the architects came from the West, and actually all China did was build the stuff. I was just wondering if the panel could talk a bit more about the importance of actually building the stuff. One good example, I think, is the maglev in Shanghai. Because I think Manchester had a maglev for a little while, but it didn't work very well. Birmingham was it? But obviously it's worked in Shanghai. It's not very long at the moment, but now they're talking about putting a maglev between Beijing and Shanghai. So actually doing things is part of that innovative process. You need to be able to build things to make that technology work. So if you can talk about the relationship between basically the German manufacturers that are behind this and the practicality of making things happen.
Okay, any more? Yep, in the green.
Yeah, I kind of think we shouldn't overestimate the capacity of emerging markets at this stage to really come up with, new things and lead the world. I think it's a very, very, I'm not an expert on innovation, but so far as I've looked at development issues, it's a hugely difficult thing to do, to set up, have the culture and the traditions to come up with these things, and the political environment as well. And that's a question I'd like to throw out, like, is having a liberal environment better than a command economy kind of thing? I was listening to a lecture on aerospace industry in my work the other day, and Boeing was speaking. And I spoke like Boeing and Airbus, and there's no other airplane company in the world. And I said, well, how about Brazil? They've got, they produce airplanes in Russia and China, and don't you think these are going to, you don't seem to take them into account at all. They think the whole world belongs to them, and so on. And they were saying that, Brazil wasn't, they would probably do some joint venture with Brazil and then move on. China, similarly. Russia, they said, Russia's, the Soviet Union sent a man to the moon, but he said the culture of creating and producing cutting-edge aeroplanes is completely gone there. And, it's not going to come back anytime soon. So this whole thing, I think the politics, the traditions, the soft things are really the difficult ones to gauge.
Yeah, let's come back to some of these issues. Because I think just to reiterate some of the points that are made around, the maglev example, for example, where, what really is the problem when, if you like, the West can supply the ideas that perhaps China and the emerging markets don't necessarily have themselves, and they themselves use their brute force resources and engineering prowess to develop these things further. Is there really an issue there at all to be debated? So who wants to have a go at that, and anything else they want to?
I was just thinking about the Louvre last time I went to it. I.M. Pei had put a great big pyramid in the middle of it. I think that there are selective examples that one can choose of great ideas coming from the West, whilst ignoring a huge number of them that are coming from sources that you don't necessarily pay attention to because they're just not on your radar screen. And one of the sort of revolutionary things that you're going to see, I'll just take the example. I worked in international development. I banged my head against that wall for a dozen years or so. And I quit because it wasn't working. And I like to see things that work. I want to contribute. I like to be, useful. And there we had a lot of ideas to give. And they didn't result in anything except for, well, a couple more vaccinations and a few more schools. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to get killed by my colleagues at the World Bank. But the thing is that there wasn't a lack of ideas. There was a lack of ability to implement. And it's perhaps China is going to revolutionize Africa. I can tell you that for no money now. You put your stakes in Chinese railways, which are going to be spanning the Congo and solving the war there eventually. Not right now, unfortunately. China will absolutely transform the economy of Africa. Now, if that's not a big idea, then I don't know what is.
Okay.
Parminder? Sure. I think we have to look at when we talk about the kind of environment that's created for businesses to exist. Then in a way that's where part of the innovation has happened in places like China and India. In India, it's partly about liberalization, and it's about addressing the needs of financing so that entrepreneurs can function. They have a huge problem with infrastructure. At the moment, they don't have much of an infrastructure, and that's one of the big problems that they will have to start maintaining that rate of growth that they're currently experiencing. And so a lot of it is about the environment that's being fostered. China has developed because of economic zones and so on and so forth, and that these are the kind of critical decisions that governments are going to have to make and support, and they'll have to make the decision. I'll be interested to know a little bit more about the way in which China will transform Africa. And you mentioned Congo, and there are resource issues, and the fact that if I'm not, I can see that it's having a very positive effect. I can see how it can have these effects, but actually longer term, is this sustainable for Africa? Are they going to have the kind of industries and businesses that will help them develop their own economy themselves? So I think there are lots of question marks still thrown up about places like China.
Okay, Norman?
Well, not to follow. I want to pick up on one question that was raised about the kind of environment and the culture of failure, because I think this is a very critical question with regard to entrepreneurship. In other words, the real dissemination of innovation, as opposed to where the research or whatever might come from. But there is this discussion, there is this argument that says that when you look at cultures like China, where there isn't a culture of failure, where in fact when you look at the command economy or whatever, the kind of predominant outlook is one of, which is very kind of process driven, process outcome driven. The kind of it suggests that kind of argument tends to suggest is that there's very little imagination, there's very little scope for experimentation or whatever. I'm not sure if that's the case or not, and indeed, I don't think we know enough about exactly what goes on there. When you do look at some of the research that's going on, there is some very interesting basic research being done, which I don't see happening anywhere else in the world, and it almost seems like research for the sake of research. The kind of university systems that they're trying to develop, etc. So I don't know whether they can contain it within that, whether indeed in that environment that can flourish or not. That remains to be seen. And Japan as well is quite an interesting example, because I think you raised this and you made this point about Japan. Again, there's the real stereotype. If you remember in the 80s and 90s when transistor radios, all you could say about Japan was, oh, they're very good at copying technologies and all of that. But if you look at today, there's certain technologies and spheres that Japan is way ahead of the world in. Optical screens, for example, mobile technologies, etc. They are way ahead of everybody else. So how come they've been able to do that there in a culture which is most definitely driven by failure, and you're out, you've finished, you cannot. It's not like Silicon Valley. Failure is a kind of badge of honor. In Japan, you just that's certainly the case. And I know quite a lot of young Japanese people in the corporate world, in the telecom space, and I can tell you their frustration is that they cannot challenge anybody who's older than them. The hierarchies in their companies, etc. Phenomenally. Now, how come there are some industries in Japan where they've been able to achieve that? Look at Sony, what Sony's become. So clearly there's something else going on here, which I don't think we know enough about, because I think it is quite specific to those societies. I think it does relate, again, I'll just throw this out, in terms of the education systems. I think education systems are very, very important. There's quite interesting studies being done now on the relationship between that kind of culture of innovation and the kind of and what, of course, we have this notion that the kind of liberal environment is one which will allow ideas to flourish and questioning and all of that. And certainly anecdotally, even when I used to be an academic, and the kind of students I would meet from Asia, I did find them to be incredibly bookish, particularly Japanese students who would never question anything. And just accepted everything you said. And you think, well, how in that environment, how do you create thinkers? How are you going to create people that are going to push the boundaries of knowledge if that's the kind of culture that they're growing up in? But then again, of course, you've got to remember that in China, a lot of the people that are doing this stuff were actually educated in the West and have got a lot of their experience in the West and now taking that back to China, the kind of diaspora, and India as well. So that's an interesting clash there as well. So these are little unknowns. I think what it tells us is that we have to do a lot more research on this and understand this at a much deeper level.
Because my sort of thought on what you just said is that, I mean, for example, when you talk about Sony, why they are so innovative as an organisation, surely that's also because of their very apparent exposure to the West. That's where they, interact and sell and engage. And so from that, my worry about China is that although you say that they've got thousands of scientists and designers even doing their thing and doing basic applied research, it's just the point where they are not necessarily exposed to any alternative culture, idea, kind of intellectual, shall we say, viewpoint beyond their own. And so they're all very, very intellectually capable, but they're not necessarily challenged perhaps by an external kind of competition, which forces them to focus perhaps. I mean, how would you all kind of respond to that briefly? Or not? Yeah.
The science and technology space is one in which there's this huge emphasis, as far as I can tell, on the lone guy in his garage or whatever, and just beavering away for 20 years until the eureka moment, or the venture capitalist going out there and failing, and it's just a very one-man band kind of equation. And what I would say is that probably the wonderful thing about a lot of the emerging economies, the cultural issues that we've been talking about, is that if you marry that idea with an infrastructure which can take the good ideas and run with it, then that's the best of both worlds. But if there's a lack of culture of the guy sitting in his garage, you better believe that the Chinese and the Indians are going to develop that culture real quick. And in 20 years, they're also going to have the infrastructure and the people and the folks who can take the good ideas and run with it. So,
I'm happy to, yeah. No,
all right, so who else wants to speak? Just before you, over there, and then we'll take you. I see you, don't worry.
Get a cup of coffee.
In the corner.
I think what is important not to forget is that innovation in itself is a process. So there's been also criticism for saying that Japan might not be good in innovation because it's a process-driven country. But innovation is a process. I mean, innovation doesn't happen because someone sits down under a tree and just thinks, I'm going to go and start this website. I mean, the best entrepreneurs and the ones who actually come up with the most ideas are usually the ones who say, I've spent consciously developing a process for coming up with innovative ideas. And then I think the other important thing, which is quite crucial to the whole debate, is that in terms of things which actually are seen by the general population as innovative, by businesses and enterprises, the technology at the key of them is not developed because of them or precisely for them. If you imagine like sort of two lines, academia or research is always step ahead. And it's about people having ideas and then saying, I want to develop this gadget or this technology, and then just going out and picking the important bits from academics and implementing them. So, in a way, the culture you have in Japan or in China, where you have the people who can go and get the stuff done, is actually exactly what you need. And it's very the original point about the Olympics, because we know in the UK what we need to do. We need to build top-class infrastructure, we need to build top-class stadiums and impressive venues and all of these. So that is not sort of, the idea is that all you need to do is go out and actually get the infrastructure and the technology and the people to build it. So I think actually the answer is quite simple in this way.
Okay, right, Phil.
I agree 100% with what you're saying there in two areas. One is like there's a bit of a danger of falling into a bit too much national stereotyping. I think all of us in the room agree that international collaboration is the best way of moving forward, and probably a high proportion of us would agree that's one of the great potentials of the internet that gives us, that we can actually collaborate across border. But I really think to stereotype, the Japanese don't really question things, the Chinese all those coffee things and so on, I really think that is a little bit falling into the trap of what we were trying to get away from. But I think the more important point is what innovation is, because I think there's a danger in the discussion of and this not specifically for this discussion, but it's generalised discussions about innovation in the West, is that we, I think, tend to fetishize innovation, and through that, we mystify it, and we make it into something more than it is, when it's really quite a natural process, which comes with economic development. Who have been the main innovators of the last 150 years? They've been the strongest economies. They've been Britain, they've been Germany, they've been America, they've been Japan. It is a byproduct of a cumulative process of productive investment. Right? And it's not more than that. So when we're talking about, we're looking at, are the Eastern people creative? Are they imaginative? Can they come up with ideas? It's really a lack of imagination on our own part to even discuss it in that sort of way. Creativity is something which is a process. It arises on the foundation of what already exists, right? I mean, we can have a discussion about incremental and radical innovation and so on, but I think we probably agree that some of that language itself tends to fetishize what innovation and creativity is. To be creative, you have to understand what exists at the present time, pull it apart, see what's wrong with it, and create from that, create the next step from that. And if you have a dynamic of accumulation going, which you have at the moment quite evidently in China in particular, as the powerhouse of the region. We know it's more localized and specific within India, and again more localized in some other parts. But taking China as the extreme, there is a dynamic of accumulation going on there. It's not just there's lots of people, but there's lots of investment going on. There's lots of R&D going on. I mean, if you look at the numbers, if you have what is the third, fourth largest economy in the world, when you know that manufacturing in China is now on a par with Japanese in terms of its value production and is quite rapidly encroaching on the United States, when you have the level of productive investment going on there, then the ideas will come out of that, the ideas will flow out of that. And I think to somehow say that it is something that's culturally limited within certain national areas, I think is falling into a very, very big trap. So I think the innovation is there already, and probably just people don't fetishize it so much there. They're just getting on and producing things and doing the next step. And to the extent to which people are saying, well, are we going to be affected by this? Damn right we're going to be affected by this, but in a very positive way, I think. And in fact, I think that could be one of the things, just to conclude. And when Parminder said, which in the description is right, if you've got mature economies here who are trundling along and not innovating and not, in a Schumpeterian way, destructively creating, if they're not actually getting rid of the last batch of investment of 15 years ago and actually building something new, then they are going to stagnate. And perhaps it's going to be the Asians who, okay, don't have that legacy, but also aren't affected by that legacy or aren't affected by that short-termist thinking, I don't think, who will actually then be stimulating, but unless the West gets its act together, it's going to be pushed out of so many markets. And I think in that, we shouldn't fetishize also, or we shouldn't be narrow just looking at IT. I think that's a bit sort of 20th century, right? The technologies in which we'll be looking at the innovation is the nanotechnologies and the genetics and those areas, which there's going to be a lot of scope for leapfrogging for what already exists in the West.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
This question of is there a cultural divide, or is there a cultural divide, or is it an intergenerational divide? I mean, I think to take this straight, Phil, to take up Phil's point that innovation happens in dynamic economies. Isn't there something of a question about where your economy is? And in the West, our picture of the future is getting kind of fuzzy because we don't know where we want to go. We're trying to grow our economies into a sort of sustainability straitjacket. And it's difficult for industry, and industry has this kind of this dilemma, which is that Western thought was increasingly getting its head around this idea of should we have more stuff or not? And if you're in the West and you're consuming at the rate that people are consuming in the West, that's a big question. If you're in China and you're consuming at the rate that people are in China or in Africa, then the question of should we have more stuff or should we have less stuff, should we be consuming less, that question is a lot less fuzzy. And so technology has the capacity technology has the ability technology remains in that kind of heroic phase that in the West it was in the mid-century when we were saying through technology, through the development of innovation, technology and industry marching forward, we make everybody's life better. That rhetoric has been sort of weakened and undermined in the West, and that may not be a bad thing. It may be that there are that these sustainability constraints are real, but it makes it more difficult for people to talk about progress as a uniquely benevolent force, and the development of industry is a uniquely benevolent force than it is in China, where people can see over 1 and 2 generations, they can see their lives being transformed and improved by technology.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to come back to some of these points?
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I'd love to weigh in about this Schumpeterian creative destruction kind of idea. I guess I actually, I'm going to say that culture does matter, because there are certain, for the very reasons that you said, the agglomeration of stuff and cargo and lots of academic places into one place means that there is going to be a natural sinkhole that is associated with innovation and academic progress.
I agree entirely on that, but
And-
national culture, I think, was being emphasized.
Well, then, okay, so I was going to talk about the French, because they're my, I love talking about the French, because, you know, all they do is they have a 35-hour work week, and they eat a lot, and they, you know, talk with their hands and stuff, and they do all these French things, and the ones who really want to work come to the United Kingdom to actually, you know, the 300,000 people now who are French in this country. I don't mean to alarm you or anything. But the fact is that people go to countries which are associated with whatever it is that they're interested in, right? So the United Kingdom, and London in particular, until recently was a financial interesting place to be. And in the United States, because of the policies of the last 8 years, bio research has moved over here, which is super. But it's only a matter of, it means that the US is not associated with it, and the UK is. So why is that not a cultural thing? I mean, an agglomeration of policies means that, that you are going to have certain cultures and nations associated with certain things. And I don't think that's a bad thing, unless it's talking about the Japanese having a particularly small set of hands or whatever, which is, you know, just racist. So I don't think that associating cultures is racist necessarily, although often it is. The other thing is about when you talk about creative destruction, you're talking about Boeing, for example. Now, Boeing makes planes. I don't see why you need to have a big next idea about planes, because planes are planes are planes, unless they're supersonic great planes. But they're still a plane. You know, there's nothing transformative about that. So I don't see why Boeing would want to partner with Brazil unless there were cheaper costs associated with it. I think that's just an idea. They've got an idea. It's planes, airplanes, and how best to build them. It's not a transformative thing in the way that biochemistry is at the moment.
Okay, Parminder.
Yeah, I agree on the business of the innovation process, and I think that that's really important to understand and get to grips with, and also understand how each individual country is addressing the business of innovation, and that it is slightly different, and that again, the growth rates that we're seeing in places like India and China, the development and the way in which they're growing and the innovation that's required to generate this growth is different, or it can be argued that it's different. And I would suggest that in India, possibly it's a little bit more. Well, actually, no, I won't say that because I'm talking off the top of my head, and I don't want to risk sort of saying something that I'll regret afterwards. But I do think there are differences in terms of that innovation, and we should look into that. The business of how new industries will come along and whether we will be affected enormously by, let's say, the internet, I think is possibly underplayed. I think it is much more important to understand how this is going to affect us. So, for example, if South Korea, Japan, China are much more involved and engaged with the web and with blogging and with getting in touch and, you know, VoIP and so on and so forth, then actually they are in a better position to take advantage of the different opportunities that are going to come about. Here's an example. I have one of my relatives actually who's now 56 years of age, and his entire life he's been an engineer. He's been working on lathes, and he's one of a handful of people now who he's gone after. Obviously, the engineering industry has changed and shrunk enormously, but he did buy his own lathe before the last company he worked for, and he now turns precision parts for anyone who wants to have these precision parts. And there isn't a huge demand for it in the UK at the moment, but there is quite a big demand for it internationally. And also the big corporations who don't have these R&D businesses or looking into this area of engineering because they can't afford to, all of a sudden are getting in touch with him and saying, we need this part created so that we can then reproduce it using CNC technology and so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden here he's gone from being unemployed for a few years with a man with a lathe in Hastings to potentially working in an international business, getting in touch with China and so on and so forth. And so that's how I think it affects us and how we need to understand how we can connect into this. And the other example I give in big industries do the same thing. Yeah, the big industries do a very similar thing. I noticed that it was First Direct, the bank, the online banking service, and I noticed that they now have videos on their website to show you what's an offsetting mortgage and so on and so forth. They're probably a bit more innovative than most of our media industry at the moment, and I think that that's something we need to look into.
Right. Norman.
Yes. Well, yes. Okay. To come back on Phil, without stereotyping anything, I do think that there is a cultural dimension to this. For example, I would say that I very much agree with the point. It is about process, and it is about it's not just invention. I think you've got to separate invention from innovation and the implementation of things, and that very much does depend on a whole number of factors. But I would say that one of the big questions I have in my mind, okay, I agree with Phil's basic proposition that in dynamic economies, that's where the innovation has occurred. And if we look at innovation in the 20th century, the end of the 21st, it has happened in the dynamic economies. I mean, why is America still in the lead in almost every single industry in the world today? That's the legacy of the dynamism and the growth of the US economy. But the culture that we have today, I would say, the business culture is one of risk aversion, is one of holding back. Some of the points about growth is not good, the questioning of all of that stuff, blah blah blah. You don't have to repeat all of those arguments. If you look, and this is why I think you need to do some qualitative research on actually what's going on in China, because there is a distinction, for example, between the kinds of R&D investments being made by Western companies in India as opposed to what they're doing in China. In India, they are using India much more to develop products that are global products. So, for example, in semiconductors and things like that are sold beyond India. In China, one of the big reasons for investing in China is to get into the Chinese market. And that's very interesting, because that means that there's a much greater dynamic of solving a problem in China, which actually means that R&D might have a greater positive impact on thinking and future innovation in China than, for example, in India. It's quite an interesting point. Now, I do think that the kind of cultural thing is important. I still would stick by my argument. I'm not going to get into this discussion about whether it's a racist stereotype or whatever, but I think that there is a certain dynamic, because you have to look at the difference. For example, if you go to universities in the US and universities in Japan and look at the relationship between that and innovation and entrepreneurship, if you've ever been to MIT or to Stanford, now I was involved with MIT for a number of years through France Telecom. I can tell you it's unlike anything I've ever seen in any university, and I went to universities when we went to Japan as well. It's a very, very different environment. It's a very different culture in terms of what students do, what their lecturers allow them to do, etc. It's extremely different. And it's not just that. Around the universities, you have the kind of VC communities. You have all that kind of stuff going on. You don't have that replicated in a lot of other places in the world. And I would argue that's, maybe you could say it's nationally specific, not whether it's an inbuilt cultural thing, but it is about the process. It's about all those other elements that are part of that process which are missing. I don't see that in China. China, yes, there is a lot of VC money going into China now, and it is mainly through Chinese students that have been educated in America, going back and getting VC because they've got connections to Silicon Valley. And there is quite a bit of venture capital coming in. But it's not happening on a scale anything like you see in America or whatever. And that kind of raises questions in my mind about where this dynamic will go. When I look at the strictures that Western companies are putting on R&D in China, you think, well, are they going to impose that same kind of narrow-mindedness in terms of just wanting to get products out the door, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether they can control that remains a question that's open. But that to me is a big question. I don't think that it's clear at this point as to what is actually going to. And just by saying, well, they're dynamic and they're growing, and therefore that concludes that they're going to innovate, I don't think you can draw that simple conclusion.
Okay, I've got about 5 minutes for more questions, so hands up. Who wants to speak? Phil, you're the only one at the moment.
I think people are confusing things. Of course there's, confusing different things. Of course there are national differences in the way education systems are run, in the way research is organised. There are different ways of doing things. You know, the French are different. You know, they have the Spanish are different. You know, people have different ways that they run their lives. Of course it is. But is that a determinant of the pace of innovation in those countries? I mean, I do not see that Japanese innovation has been held back by those university differences that you're describing. I think, you know, maybe in, you know, some sort of tempo and a sort of a variant side, but the more fundamental material basis for change, for being able to innovate, for technological advance, for being able to produce, you know, 12% per annum productivity growth in China against, you know, 1.5% in the West, that's a product not of the national differences in the way people behave and have lunch breaks and organize their institutes of technology. It's driven by productive investment and whether you're investing for the future or not. And in that sense, I took it for granted that we do accept that there is a cultural constraint in the West at the moment in terms of the lack of ambition. We're taking that for granted, but that's a socially specific thing, not a national characteristic. Second point, very quickly, just on the Chinese market. I think you're right, empirically, a lot of R&D is directed towards the Chinese market rather than is the case in India. But, you know, look at it, isn't that what you would expect? You have already a much more dynamic, expanding market at home there. But I think to make a distinction between saying somehow that limits it, or to make a distinction in those sort of changes which are going on and technological advances are going on, somehow they're going to be, again, narrowly restricted to China, is I think wrong. The sort of specialty steels, the sort of what's happening in the car industry, what's happening in chemicals and stuff, all that is going to have a global impact, even if it is originally developed for a local market, because it's such a massive market, and nobody's going to avoid it.
Okay, more. This guy here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually interested more in the impacts that this will have on Africa. I mean, is it the case that, I mean, for instance, the innovation that takes place in China, you know, simply, for instance, if you take Norman's point there in QQ, where it's an excellent example of a business model with a long tail revenue, which is basically where anyone can be a consumer. Will those innovations have a radical impact on Africa? And will we see houses, cars, innovations in the production, the process, to actually make a difference and move away from the terrible mistakes of the past that the West has imposed on Africa with regard to appropriate technologies and intermediate technologies and basic rubbish. And unfortunately, MIT were a part of this.
Okay.
$100 laptops are useless.
Any more? Yep.
This is probably another overgeneralisation that makes any very interesting question. I heard some people saying that companies investing in China, the reason they invest in China is for manufacturing, sort of plant workforce or what have you. Then you look at investment in India, and it's very different. It's IT, it's call centres, which is probably very bottom level to it. And it probably goes down to the political system. The Chinese political system is very good for organising factories in. India is more of a democracy. You've got more free speech that might tie in, why you have IT. Would you agree with that? Is there truth in that?
Okay, and the lady in green.
Okay, and I'm finding I agree with a lot of what everybody's saying, but not everything. And I think perhaps one of the reasons is that I think the point Phil made on development and innovation is, I think, pretty basic and can't really disagree with that. And I think you were coming back saying, yeah, well, what about the difference between France and the UK? And obviously they're pretty developed already. So what we're really talking about is a significantly lower level of development and how you innovate from there up.
Okay.
So, okay, but the only thing I wanted to say was that I think what could be interesting for this discussion is to also look at where not innovation has come about and study it, but where it's been destroyed. That's the point I was trying to make with Russia.
Right.
And,
okay.
Come up with some ideas.
Yep. Right, any more? Gone. Very, very quick. You're so close.
Just a very quick question. All panelists, what do you think is your one opinion held on emerging markets and innovation that the other two panelists would mostly disagree with.
Okay, right. Now we only have 2 minutes for the session left remaining. So, in the interest of brevity, Dinah, can you go first? Just sum up very briefly.
May be missing, and my response to more or less all the questions so far would be that policies are the differentiator. And so in India, it started to innovate and become much more of an innovator when trade policies were relaxed and government relinquished control of a lot of the economic trade. In the case of Africa, one of the biggest problems that Africa has is that it doesn't have roads and it doesn't have infrastructure. One of the reasons is because it doesn't have a tax base, it doesn't have corruption policies, it doesn't have private property rights, and those are the policies that it is lacking. And until it has that, then we will continue to see it fail. So I would say that the one underlying theme in all of this is policies. And one last thing about sustainability, as a sustainability person, is that consumption does not equal innovation. You can have decoupled economic growth. You can decouple that from carbon emissions. And I probably should have said that on behalf of BT.
Okay, thanks.
I'd kind of follow on from that and say I've been surprised at how little mention of government has actually sort of happened in this conversation. I think there are two kind of key factors driving a lot of this innovation in whatever country we're talking about. One is obviously government policy and where they're directing finance, money, support, basic research. And the other is foreign direct investment. And foreign direct investment comes because there is a purpose and there is a sense of people see that there is opportunities available, or organisations, global corporations, and they determine, if you like, a lot of where the innovation will take place, and then go and support it. And I'll stick to that. So we've got 2 minutes.
1 minute, Norman.
1 minute. Well, I think there's a very interesting new dynamic being established. I think undoubtedly what's happening in China and India, the dynamic that's unleashed there is, in my opinion, is unstoppable. I think that is where a huge amount of new things are going to happen, and I don't just mean replications of what's happened. I think if you look at particularly if you look at the investments that are happening in pharmaceuticals, in biotechnology, in nanotechnologies, I think that we should not be surprised if the big breakthroughs in the next 15, 20 years will come from those countries, because that's where their investment is, that's where the attitude is, that's where the culture is of a real belief in this, and the application of that to the benefit of those societies. So I think that's going to have a huge impact. But there is it's just one point, just a final point for you to think about. You know, someone was very contemptuous of the $100 laptop. Now, I was very contemptuous when I read about this, but when I've actually seen the $100 laptop, and I've seen kids in these areas using it, it's actually very, very encouraging, because it is $100, but it's actually a phenomenally good piece of technology. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, if in Africa you can get kids onto the internet at $100 a laptop, you know, that's going to be good. That's going to result in good things. And, you know, there are things happening in Africa today which are very surprising, which once again are very hidden from the West, particularly around mobile technologies, which for the first time, you know, you are talking about technologies that don't have a very huge barrier of entry, because you don't need huge amounts of capital to get into that game. And as a consequence, we're seeing this technology getting into the hands of people who are solving real problems for themselves, and as a consequence are coming up with some new applications, new services, which for the first time I think there's going to be a transfer of that technology into the West, and not the other way around. And it's a very interesting dynamic. It's a very early dynamic, but that does mean the world has changed very significantly in that respect.
I'll be very brief.
I'm afraid Norman has sparked off more debate.
Okay, it's actually not so much a debate. I just wanted to plug a really fantastic website that you should have a look at to see types of innovation, particularly in Africa, using Safaricom. It's called myc4.com. You may have heard of it. It's a Danish company. It's about microfinancing, and it's about how each of us, all of us, could become effectively investors in enterprises in Africa. And it's a sort of variation on charities and social entrepreneurship.
I'm going to have to stop it there, but I really do want to thank our panel for a very, very stimulating debate. Thank you very much. And before you leave, I have one very quick announcement, because if you really have been fired up by this debate, as I have, please continue the discussion at the ESRC Battle of Ideas blog, and you'll find that in the exhibition space. Okay, thank you very much.